That's what people say. That's how we start every show. Miami's on Fire is about everything that's going on in Miami that makes it such an interesting and hot place for all kinds of stuff, including real estate, vacationing, investing in opening offices, starting new businesses. We are the entrepreneurial capital of the United States, and it's for good reason, because there's a lot of office opportunities, a lot of infrastructure for people to start their businesses. And what I do specifically is related to office leasing of all kinds for landlords and tenants, as well as investment sales for office. And I do some other stuff whenever a client needs retail, warehouse, etc. But it's 85% to 90% office. In fact, we have some buildings for sale right now. I suggest you look us up on Lee & Associates, South Florida. My info is all there. The reason why we wanted to do the show today about office is because it is one of the most important parts of our market and often overlooked, because residential is so interesting. There are so many celebrities here who own mansions, who like to party down here, and they really create a lot of buzz around the idea of buying real estate. And then you have people like Ken Griffin and others who not only own real estate compounds, but also are building things like office buildings in Brickell and elsewhere. And you have really large players in this market from Latin America that are here operating their offices, their businesses. Some of those spaces have shrunk over time, but they're still important players in this market. And, Miami has always been the gateway to the Americas, and that really has not changed. What has changed is that landlords are competing more in many cases for tenants, right? And the reason is because tenants are changing how they view their work environments. They're either shrinking, or in some cases, for smaller businesses, they're not working out of their offices at all, right? They're working from home. Why not? If they can create an environment at home that works, and then maybe they have small children and they need to put a lot of time into that, working from home can be a really good option for a lot of professionals. But there is this pull back to the office market, and what I'm hearing and seeing a lot of is people trying to be closer to their homes when they do choose an office. So they only want a 5-minute drive or a 10-minute drive because the alternative is not something that adds to their quality of life. So if they are going to make that investment, they want it to be close to home. So what I wanted to do today, since Peter Zalewski, my partner, is not here, thank God, because now I can get a couple of words in edgewise, because, Peter is a chatty Cathy over here. What I wanted to do today was just talk a little bit more in detail, roll up our sleeves about how people should be thinking about office when they are going to move forward, and give you 5 tips that might help you think through this decision, which is so important. So the beginning of this story is really about your vision for what your business is really all about. And if you're a business that needs a lot of foot traffic, people walking in, and you depend not only on regular customers who are there every month, and you also depend on, just random people walking by, retail can be a really good use. For traditional office, professional space, oftentimes, that is really all about creating an environment that is conducive to idea generation, right? And hopefully shortening the amount of time required to execute actions that are going to generate more revenue, right? Bringing clients to your office to make sure that they see, you're a physical space, you have all these people, you're committed and invested in the business, and that is going to reflect on the service they offer you. Also, the idea is that you want to spend time with them, face-to-face time, because in our AI world now, many people think, and I think it's being put out there, that AI can replace everything, right? We're all going to lose our jobs. But I think real estate is one of the few areas that can 100% with confidence say that it's all about relationships, because many times you're dealing with people that you've dealt with over the years, and they trust you and they know you, and that's where you're going to be able to make a better deal for your client. And that doesn't work with AI. I get a lot of calls now, which is strange, through AI. They leave messages that you can tell are created by a computer, and they're really strange. Sometimes they have gaps or weird words. In some cases, some email activity is like that too. So having a person involved in the transaction that can respond to you quickly, that can, answer your questions in an efficient manner and understands what you're really getting at. Sometimes people are sort of fishing without knowing because they're trying to figure out what they don't know, right? So having an experienced agent that can help you determine what the real information is that's going to help you make a decision is very important. So I recommend always that you work with an agent. It's worth the money. If you're a tenant, you're not paying any of that. The landlord is going to incorporate that into their pricing. And if you're a tenant, prospective tenant, and you're not working with an agent, you're still paying that amount. So oftentimes it's very not only practical, but also in essence, you're paying for it. So you might as well take advantage of it. And what an agent can bring to you is invaluable. They can fix a lease that might have some issues, that might have some clauses in there or language that you don't really understand. And it's important to get all that out of the way before you sign anything, because leases are often, long-term commitments, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, in some cases 10 years for larger companies. And if you're building out the space, right? Sometimes you go into a space and it's a wreck, or even it could be a nice space, but you want more walls, less walls, more offices, you want a bathroom in the space, maybe you want different lighting, a different quality. Then it's important to have someone, a professional, that can help you negotiate that, right? Because oftentimes, especially if a landlord is not using an agent, they're relatively new, they do all the work themselves, they can offer you things that feel like ultimatums, right? This is the only choice you have. And an agent can really help you define and clarify what's possible, right? So you should never think that a potential transaction is a done deal. It's not written in stone. Every point generally is negotiable, and you can often figure out ways to make a better deal for yourself, whether you're a landlord or a tenant. So what I'm going to start with is the idea of 5 tips that are going to help you make better choices, right? And this is general information that you should know because it's out there. It's collected in a lot of different places. And maybe if you ever have a question about real estate, opening an office, etc., you can ask an AI to help you define things that you may not know, and that's a useful tool. But again, a person can react very quickly, respond to sort of like the undercurrent that you're trying to get at, that you maybe you don't realize you're getting at, or maybe you are, targeting something specific, and they can get at it pretty quickly. So the first thing we're going to talk about is submarkets, right? It's very, very, very important to understand the submarkets, meaning, Miami-Dade County is the overall market, and then you have submarkets within that: Coral Gables, Brickell Avenue, Coconut Grove, South Miami, Kendall, etc. And all those markets have different pricing. So Brickell has the highest pricing for office right now in the country, which sounds insane because New York has always been that. right? Everybody knows that. But now Brickell is charging some crazy prices. To some degree, it's an anomaly because what's happening is that you have players like Palantir and Ken Griffin coming down, and they're looking for something very specific and willing to pay higher prices to get that. And as a result of that, it's creating the sense that the entire market is like that, and it's not. What happens is there are pockets of activity and they set a certain price. Same thing happens in residential. And when you set that very high price, all the other agents are looking at that and they're saying, wow, I want the same thing. If I was charging $80 a square foot, now I can go to 90 because Ken Griffin just established 200 a square foot or whatever it might be. The reality is that not all markets work that way. It really depends on the building, the submarket, the amount of amenities that are available, and there are a lot of other variables that are super important to understand. So for you to make the best decision and go in there with confidence that you're going to get the best result, one of the things you need to do is know your budget in advance. What is your budget on a monthly basis? And when I say that, I'm not just talking about rent, because oftentimes when anybody is talking about rent, either if you're an agent or a landlord, it's the base that they're talking about, right? How much are you paying just for your base? Then they add on the expenses, right? So the base could be, let's say, $35 per square foot, and then your expenses are another $10 per square foot. And the expenses relate to what the costs are to operate the building. So it could be maintenance, insurance, taxes, etc. And that's tagged on to the base rent. So that's an important aspect of the process that you need to understand, is that especially when you're Googling and you're looking at stuff like LoopNet and different things, you'll see that there are some office spaces that are identified as triple net, and you'll know this because it'll have 3 N's, right? N as in Nancy, triple net, and the first number in that is going to relate to the base, and then the number that's usually not disclosed online is what's called the CAM or expense, and that number can raise your rent by a significant amount. So you got to make sure that when you're searching and calling, and I get these calls all the time, people are like, oh, so you only charge $35 a square foot, right? Because they're not familiar with triple net. And then I say, well, that's the base. And then there's another, whatever it is, $10 per square foot for the expenses. That changes everything, right? Because they thought that their budget was going to be $3,000 a month. And now it's gone up to whatever the number is, right? 4,000, 5,000, etc. So it's super important to understand what is the ceiling on what you will pay. Very, very important. Part of that is going to also involve, especially if you're in retail, understanding that when you're getting the base and the expense, it doesn't take into account the utilities, right? So the electric, the water, the Wi-Fi, not included usually, right? So all those things are things that you should be asking about when you talk to anybody, an agent, a landlord, another business owner, a bank, etc. Having those conversations in an educated way is super important because it's going to get you where you need to go very quickly and eliminate a lot of wasted time. Because you may be thinking your budget is $3,000 a month and you're looking at spaces that are going to end up being $5,000 a month. So you made calls and they explain this to you and you're like, wow, I just wasted a whole day making calls on spaces that I cannot afford, right? Another thing to take into consideration is that the term on your lease, whether it's 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, will have an increase on an annual basis. So after a year, it'll go up by a certain percentage, and it'll say that in the lease. It'll say 3%, 4%, 5%. And that is also something that you should be considering when you're thinking about your budget, right? Because it's not only your first year, it's the second year, the third year, etc., that you need to think about when you're talking about your budget. So Very important. Also, I think it's important to understand what the real market is, right? Overall, because oftentimes what happens is we get calls from people who are very interested in opening a business or expanding or etc. They haven't been in the market for some time, or they've never been in the market before, and they don't really understand where the prices really are. So they think that, $3,000 a month for a medical office space is a reasonable amount to pay, because maybe 10 years ago they had signed a lease and that number was roughly that. But things have changed a lot, right? Pricing has gone up. So you have to be open to what is happening in the market right now. And if your lease is expired and you had like a 3% increase, especially for new property owners that are seeking tenants, and you call one of those property owners, you're going to find that if they're new, they just paid a high price for their building, and they're going to try and make up that money somehow. And part of how they're going to do that is to increase the cost per square foot in their building. So maybe you had been in that building 10 years ago, but you now have a new owner, your lease is expiring or has expired, and they're telling you they're going to increase your per square foot cost by $5, $10. It could be that much or more, and that's going to blow out your budget. I've had that happen many, many times, and we've been fortunate enough to be able to locate spaces for those individuals who are seeing that kind of spike. In fact, Brickell is going through that specific experience. They're actually dealing with flight, because a lot of business owners are looking at their increases and they're like, I can't afford this. The great thing about our market is that Coral Gables and Coconut Grove can be alternatives. More so Coral Gables, because it's a much larger office market, more mature. Coconut Grove is a mature market, but it's tiny, right? And there isn't a whole lot of new product coming on. So it's going to be more expensive generally. You're going to have fewer choices, and it's even though it's very popular, it's hard to get in there. So getting back to the submarkets, know your submarket. If you say you want to be in Coconut Grove, which I get a lot of calls about, expect to pay a premium, very high premium, for the very limited space that's available, and expect it to take a while, because there's so little space and everybody thinks they need to be in Coconut Grove that whatever space is available gets taken very quickly, and then you're at a loss, right? So you got to be prepared not only for that, but the second submarket on your list. Again, if you're looking at Coconut Grove or Brickell, Coral Gables may be an option. Pinecrest might be an option. Aventura, depending on how far you're going to go, right? So another thing to consider here when you're thinking about an office space is how big an area can you search in? Are you okay with, right? So if you're in Brickell Avenue, are you willing to go to only downtown Coral Gables? Are you willing to go to the edges? Are you willing to go on Lejeune? Are you willing to go to other places, Coral Way even, Miracle Mile, etc.? Are you willing to go to those areas to reach your clientele, right? And also to find a space that would work for you. The reason why I say that is because many times when we talk to clients looking for office, what they're telling us is that they basically have a general idea of where they want to locate the office based on where their clients are going to come from, right? How far are they willing to drive? That's a very smart way to look at it, rather than just saying, well, my office used to be in Edgewater and now I want it to be in Pinecrest. No, that's not going to work, because unless you're willing to reinvest in creating a whole new clientele, or you have, like the magic sauce that nobody else has, people may not be willing to drive all the way from Edgewater to Pinecrest because it's too far, it's inconvenient, they're not familiar with the space, etc. So when you're thinking about a new office space, that's a very, very important question. Another one that has to do with a similar idea, how far are you willing to drive, is where your employees generally are based, right? So if your office has been in Edgewater, let's say as an example, which is a very hot office market, and we have space there, by the way, if your employees have been driving to Edgewater, they probably live in the area generally. That would be the best case scenario. Now you're asking them to drive to Florida City or Homestead or Cutler Bay, etc., and they may not be willing to do that. And then potentially you lose clients and you lose staff. So the goal here, best case scenario, is make sure that you take that into account when you're thinking about where you want to locate your office. And I'll tell you that of all the things that people take into account, that is one of the top things that I always hear. I can't go too far because I'm going to lose all my clients. That's a very smart thing to take into consideration when you're thinking about a new office. So that's another important aspect of thinking about where you want to locate yourself and your business, because it's a big commitment, obviously. And it's like buying a house. And in fact, in some cases, you're going to be spending more time in that space than in your house, because you're fielding calls, you're dealing with email, very, very important that your location feel comfortable, that it feels like a second home, that if you have a pet, maybe you take your pet, you're able to do that you can take your pet to work, because that's an important aspect of everyone's life, right? That is close to your child's school, that is convenient, that you can jump on the highway and go wherever you need to go very quickly, depending on the need. So these are all important aspects of thinking about a new space for your business that you should be considering. I'm going to get back to a topic that I began with. Sort of it creeped into one of my points here regarding triple net versus like full service gross. So a triple net is a way that a landlord and an agent can explain the costs associated with renting a space. And when you're looking online, you'll see, like I said, the 3 N's, which tell you it's triple net. So expect this base number, which is the first one you're going to see, and then this other number that's going to come in, plus utilities and all that stuff. In the case of some offices, you'll also see F as in Frank, S as in Sam, G as in goat. So that's full service gross. And what that is generally most of the stuff that you're going to be paying for is factored into one big price, right? So when you see that number, if it's FSG, you'll see that it'll be, let's say, $35 a square foot FSG. And that means that number means it covers the base, the expenses, in some cases the electric, in some cases the water, in some cases the parking. It really depends on the submarket that you're in, whether all of that is covered in that FSG. But the G is super important, right? Sometimes you'll see FS by itself. That means that pretty much everything is included. FSG generally means something is not identified readily, right? Like the parking, for example, or maybe it's janitorial, right? So when you're talking to an agent or speaking to a landlord, you should ask all these questions about what is included and what is not included, right? Because janitorial in particular, which is an important service, usually means that it's the common areas, so there's bathrooms in the hallway, those are going to be cleaned. If there are trash cans, if there's vacuuming that needs to be done. Not every building has people that come through and empty your trash cans, right? In some cases, you need to do that. You need to pay for that. And you can ask the landlord, or the agent can ask for you, hey, do you have someone that works for your building that does this type of work? Can we hire them? What do they charge? Or do you have a reference? So all of that can be done to get a better sense of what the cost is when you're looking at a space. And janitorial is super important. I mean, you could do it yourself. In fact, I had a client recently that told me the amount of trash that they generate in a week is basically like a little plastic trash can. So they could just take that with them or throw it in the dumpster. Not necessary to have an entire janitorial come in every week. But I think it's useful, and a lot of people really look forward to that in their offices to make sure that when they get there the next day, you know, there's nothing in the trash can. The office has in some cases been vacuumed, etc. So very important that you consider those that language that we use to identify how much a space costs, right? So here's another tip to consider and information that you should be thinking about when you're leasing a space. So there's a difference between usable square footage and rentable square footage, right? So the usable square footage is what is inside the actual office and what you're using in that space, whether you put a trash can, copy machine, a desk, everything in that space is what's usable. And then there's rentable. Rentable is, it takes into account some other factors like common areas, for example. And you need to understand that when you're thinking about signing leases, because it's important to make sure that you know exactly what you're getting when you commit, when you pay that deposit that's usually 3 months, right? 2 months security in the first month. When you're paying all that money, you definitely need to know what you're paying for, right? So another important tip to understand is that there is language in the lease sometimes that you need to pay very close attention to, which is anything having to do with termination clause, right? Very important. In fact, what I recommend, if you're reviewing your lease, or maybe you signed it and you haven't seen it in a couple of years, you put it in the desk drawer and closed it and haven't looked at it, is that you pull it up, open that PDF, and then just do a search for the word termination. And you'll see there are probably a couple of references in there. And you need to understand what that language is, because in some cases, the landlord has the power to terminate your lease within a certain amount of, by giving you a certain notice. And it's important to understand that, because for whatever reason, they may need to do that. Maybe they have, they're in the process of selling a building, or maybe they have a bigger client that they want to bring in and they need your space. You know, they don't have enough space, or your space has been built out and it looks great, but they can charge, you know, $10 more, $20 more, etc. Or you're a new owner and you want a clean house. You want to change the nature of the building. Maybe it was a full-on office building. Now you want to make it full-on medical, right? Which you're going to be able to charge more money for that. So these are all the variables that you need to consider in your lease. Very important to understand what is possible, how much power the landlord has over your space, right? And usually in a lease, there'll be a relocation clause that's tied in some ways to your tenancy, your term, right? So in some cases, there is a relocation clause that allows you to move to another comparable space in the building if, for whatever reason, the landlord wants to move you out. And it's usually that type of language. It's like comparable space in terms. Now, it's important to understand exactly what that is, what the language is in your lease, because you want whatever space you move to, it's an inconvenience. It's going to cost you money. It should be similar. It can't be like you spent all this money on the space, or the space was fully built out and pretty close to what you needed, and now you're being moved to a starter space, you know, that's a shell, or maybe, you know, hasn't been updated for 20 years. So you need to understand that language to make sure in your lease that you're confident and have leverage in that situation if for whatever reason it comes up during the term that you're in that space. So I'm going to give you one more tip here that I think will be important to understand. So the idea here regarding leverage in your situation, in your relationship with the landlord. It's very important to understand leverage, right? And your leverage is about how you pay your rent, how you keep your space, if you are good about the parking. All these variables are very important. So what gives a tenant leverage is that they're paying market rate. They're also on time. Every month they pay on time or early. So you never give the landlord any issues, right? You don't give the property manager any issues. You don't create situations in the bathroom where, it's a big mess when you leave. So we had a client, very important, that was coming up on their 1 year. They went 1 year out from their renewal. And it was important to begin to have that conversation with them about what they wanted to do. Now, they liked where they were. They had been there for some time, more than 5 years. And generally, they were happy. But there were some issues with the building that created, some cosmetic and some otherwise that really made them unhappy. But they were generally okay. Nothing is perfect. Some of the issues that they were bringing up was that their windows had started getting damaged by the sprinklers, by the water that was being used on the landscaping. And what it was doing was it was creating rust stains on their windows. So the rust stains had started to really creep in, and it was making their windows super foggy. So you have natural light coming into a space, very important. You paid for that, and suddenly when you look out the window, it looks like mud. That's not great, right? So they had an issue with that. They also had an issue with the fact that the bathroom was usually a mess for whatever reason. It wasn't them. They had a small staff, but the bathroom was a mess. And there was water on the floor sometimes, and paper towels everywhere, and just sometimes toilet paper wasn't available. And generally, it was not being kept up very well. So they were not happy with that. Another issue that they had was that their office was located right next to the exit door that led to the parking area. And that had become a place where people were designated to be able to smoke, right? And buildings have that, and it's okay, go outside, smoke, etc. But what was happening was that people were smoking and leaving their cigarette butts everywhere, right? So this was not making them excited about coming to work. The windows were muddy, the bathrooms were a mess. They had to deal with all this, and something that they did not expect was that the smoke from these people smoking was actually seeping into their office. So they would walk in, and it smelled like somebody had been smoking a pack in their office the night before. So not a good situation. Now, what does that do? What that does is it gives the tenant leverage. Again, they've been paying monthly, their monthly rent on time. Good people don't make trouble for the property manager or the landlord. So the landlord wants to keep them. They want to extend them. They want them to pay more for their space. How do you do that? Well, on the tenant side, they have an opportunity. And even though maybe their intent is to stay in that space, they want to communicate to the landlord and their agent or the property manager that they have every intention of potentially relocating to a whole new space, a whole new building. And that's super important because what it does is it creates a sense of urgency on the part of the landlord, and they can move faster and more efficiently, hopefully, if everything works right, if you're dealing with a professional, to make sure that you're able to stay in the building. So everyone wins from that situation. The landlord keeps a tenant that they want, that they feel is, credit worthy, great, is going to be there for a long time, adds value to their building. And then the tenant is able to negotiate better terms for themselves than they would otherwise by saying, listen, I'm a freelancer. I may move. I may need to. If these issues cannot be addressed and you throw in a sweetener, which may be like a reduction in rent, versus what was expected based on where the market is right now, or, for sure, they're going to clean the windows. For sure, they're going to move those people from that smoking area. For sure, they're going to invest more money in cleaning those bathrooms, right? And maybe they vacuum your space on a quarterly basis, in addition to whatever you pay for in janitorial, right? So the entire space is vacuumed. Maybe they paint the space, which maybe is done every 3 years. Maybe they do it every year, right? Clean up the space. So the best case scenario for anyone in any office situation, excuse me, is to make sure that you understand what you want, the location you want, submarket, how much you're willing to pay, right? And then what it is that you have in terms of expectation, right? If you're going to stay where you're at, if you're going to expand, if you're going to decrease your size, if you're looking to have more amenities, right, in your area. So you have a Chick-fil-A, you have a Target, you have, a shopping center, a Lifetime, etc. near you. Those are all great values that are outside your property that you need to consider when making these decisions for a submarket. Make sure that you know how far your employees are willing to go. Make sure you know where your clients are coming from and how far they're going to be willing to drive. All those issues are important. Make sure you understand the numbers, what they really mean, because it feels like when you're online, you're making educated decisions, right? You're looking on databases like LoopNet or CrackC or something, and you're seeing these numbers and you're like, wow, I'm getting a heck of a deal. And then when you really dig in and ask the right questions, you realize, no, actually it's more expensive than I thought. So it's important to make sure that you know what you're doing. You get help, ideally a professional that is educated about the market, that is transparent, that helps you understand the situation, that tells you everything as things are happening so that there are no surprises. I remember I had a client about a year ago that told me a tough story about TripleNet, where everything had been discussed with the agent that was representing them, and they thought they knew all the expenses. And then when it came to the lease, a new expense came into the picture, and suddenly their rent increased dramatically. Now, that's a horrible situation. That should never, ever, ever happen if you're dealing with a professional. They cannot just drop something on you like that, because tenants are going to react like that. Even if they feel like they've been working with you and everything's been going fine, you drop something on something like that on them at the last minute, and it's going to detonate. It's going to be something that could kill the deal for you, where they potentially walk away. So it's important for you to establish a good relationship, but also ask as many questions as come to mind, and that your agent, you feel, is dealing with you honestly. So I want to close out by saying thank you for coming today. I hope this was useful. I'm happy to help anyone, even if they're not my client, find spaces or get advice regarding where it might be a good place to establish an office if they're expanding, etc. I was just having a conversation here at Community Newspapers in South Miami with one of the show hosts about a potential expansion and where it might be good to look to get quality office space at a good price. And I recommend, this is a place that you can have those conversations, and it's very informal, or more formal if you want it to be. And Community News is a place I recommend highly, that you come here and call these guys and talk to them and understand what they can do for you. They have so many resources that are available to you on an ongoing basis, on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis. You get newsletters in your inbox. You get relationships that'll last you a lifetime, that are quality relationships that will build your business, but also allow you to contribute to the community in a way that maybe you never thought possible. So I recommend that you come down here or call them today and ask them how you can join the family and also maximize your dollar if you're spending money with them. They have incredible packages that involve podcasts and all kinds of different things that I think would be great for you. So, and they have people like me on shows that are talking about very important things like real estate. So I want to thank you for coming today and listening to this show. I think Peter is going to be back with us next week. I'm excited about that because, you know, he takes up like 50% of the show just in the first 10 minutes. You know, the guy is a talker. So even though he and I are usually scrapping it out here on the show, he's one of my closest friends, and I'm looking forward to seeing him next week. And he's going to give you more great information about how Miami's on fire, and probably we'll have different ideas about that. So thank you for coming. See you next week. We're going to have a great guest. We already lined that up. I'm going to do a teaser online, so look for that. And we'll see you next week on Miami's on Fire.